Hi there. Well, I think I am now live. There we go. I think I've got my comments up. Hi, my name's Kayna Prescott and I am a clinical animal behaviourist with equines. And I was asked to do a Facebook Live event for the APBC, which I'm a full member of, which is great. It's my first time doing Facebook Live, so I'm just gonna wait for a second and make sure I'm totally on. But I've decided to do my Facebook Live on the stabled horse and problems that we can see, behaviour problems that we get around stabling. There we go. I've got a few people saying hi, which is great. And why stabling can affect their behaviour and how we can optimise the stabled horse's environment. So why did I decide to do stables and things? There's lots of other behaviour problems that I look at in my private practice. Handling problems, ridden problems. Hi, Debbie. But I decided to do stabling because we ride our horses and handle our horses for a few hours a day. But how we manage them, whether they're turned out or in the stable, as many are in the UK in the winter, with our winter's dark evenings coming, at the moment we're heading towards 14, 15 hours of darkness a night, which is quite a long time if a horse is in the stable overnight. So I wanted to look at what a stable environment is like for a horse and how we can optimize that and make it as best we can. So if you've got any questions about your horse's behaviour in the stable, feel free to put them up. I've actually got a question or two that have come in from other places beforehand, so I will answer those just now. So there we go. Right. So what I was going to look at is one of the first questions I've had is from a lady who has asked about what I would recommend for a horse in the stable that appears to be very anxious, sweating, and box walking. Now, I think initially there'd be an awful lot of questions, I think I'd be looking at where does this behaviour always occur? Now, that sounds a bit crazy, is it only in the stable or does it happen in the field as well? Because that says quite a lot about the motivation of the behaviour and how established it is. I'd be looking at, does it happen at specific times in the stable? Does it happen when the owner's present? Or does it happen when the feed's coming? Does it happen when it's just come in? Is it related to when other horses are being put out? Because this can all indicate the motivation of this anxiety in this box walking. I'd also be considering whether the horse is walking slowly or if it's walking around quite fast, whether it's calling. All of these are going to give an indication of the motivation, because we can't, with box walking, it's often seen as a repetitive behaviour, like a stereotypical behaviour. And we don't want to be restricting a stereotypical behaviour. But we do want to see if we can reduce the motivation for it. Now, if the horse is in the stable, he's anxious, he's calling, he's sweating, I think one of my first things to say is turn him out as much as you can, until you figure out why the horse is so stressed in that environment. Turn him out as much as you can. There are lots and lots of new livery yards coming out with track systems, with year-round herd turnout, all that kind of thing. So I would be really looking at getting that horse out as much as possible. If for any reason the horse had to be in, there are things that you can look at in terms of box walking. If it is being conducted as a repetitive behaviour, that can help to reduce it. Box walking has been associated with lack of social contact. So you can look to optimise how the horse can see other horses, whether they're able to touch neighbours. You can have a look and see if it's possible to put a mirror in the stable. That can often help horses in those situations that are box walking or weaving. You'll be looking at what kind of exercise a horse has and whether you can increase that exercise. Box walking has been associated with paddock size, so the smaller paddocks. So let's see if you can get it out into a larger pasture for more natural turnout. So those are some of the things I'd be looking at for that. But I think the main one would be turn it out as much as you can. Really, really important. So when we consider horses and their natural behaviours, we look at what they're free living horses, how they spend their time. Now, we don't see abnormal behaviours, as we'd say, in free living horses. We don't see them weaving, cribbing. We don't see them walking around in circles or anything like that, because they are meeting their behavioural needs as a horse, which is moving, eating. Free ranging horses eat like in every hour out of 24. They mainly eat in the daytime, but they do eat throughout the night as well. And that's really, really important to consider with our horses in stables. When you've got a horse on pasture, they generally graze, again, at least 50 to 70% of their day, depending on the, these percentages do depend on the nutritive value of the grazing available, and also what other forage is available, whether they're on hay or haylage or whether it's supplemented with grain as well. Social contact is hugely important for our horses. If a horse is turned out alone, we generally see that they spend about 10% less time eating, and they are about 3 times more active in a pasture if they're on their own. Social contact is so important in terms of the grooming and all these, being able to safely sleep, to have healthy sleep. Horses need social contact. They allow groom, and all of these behaviours have got a real need. Movement is incredibly important for our horses. Generally, when you watch them graze, they'll take a few mouthfuls and they'll take another step. Then they'll take a few mouthfuls and take another step. Now, these bouts of grazing, they can last 10-15 minutes, and then they might walk on a bit further before they start grazing again. Again, like we say, about sort of 70%, 80% of their time for free living horses is spent grazing. They spend between 3 to 4 hours sleeping. Now, some of that sleep is stood up, some of it is lying down. Stables can have a big effect on sleep as well, but I'll touch on that again later. So those are the kind of natural behaviours that we need our domestic horses to be able to achieve. The movement, the social interactions, and the continuous forage. It's really, really important. And sleep. Sleep is something that can be affected by stabling. Optimal environment for sleep is where a familiar area where they feel safe, and generally with a horse watching over them, so that they can actually relax and go into that completely lying down position to get that REM sleep that they need. Now, they only sleep for 3 to 4 hours out of 24, and they're generally in quite short bursts. So they'll have 15-20 minutes of this shortwave sleep and then some REM in those 10-15 minute blocks. So when we think of horses being in for 15 hours in a stable overnight, or some horses are kept in for 22 hours out of 24, then you can see that ad-lib forage, social contact, all those needs need to be met, ideally in a stable, which is very tricky. So how can we optimise those stables? Well, in terms of sleep, you're looking at the size of the stable. It's really important. Being able to really comfortably lie down in a big area with very good bedding. The bedding does actually make an effect. And ideally, they sleep best out at pasture. But again, familiar surroundings. Now, if you consider a horse that's going out to a show, then you can imagine it takes a few days for them to settle, and by then they might be back home. So actually having sleep at a show can be really quite difficult for a horse because they're not in a familiar environment. The stables are often quite small. So that should be taken into account when horses are travelling and at those longer shows. So bedding, let's talk about straw. Lots of people are always looking at what kind of bedding material their horse is on. You'll often see beautifully manicured shavings beds and wood pellets for absorbency. But bed eating is something that horses in a stable can do. It's generally related to their natural foraging behaviour and having that choice and movement as they're eating, looking around at different places they can forage. So straw as a bedding has actually been seen to really reduce the incidence of stereotypical behaviour of horses. They believe that having that constant access to another type of forage can really help them get through that time that they're stabled. It gives them something else to do. It meets those needs. They can snuffle through their bed, searching for tasty bits of straw, which is really, really good for them. Some people don't enjoy the horses eating straw of a bed, but we do see that the horses do benefit from having a straw bed. And again, they'll sleep better on a straw bed. So there's all sorts of reasons why that would be better. Now, when we think about social interactions, I keep talking about social interactions, often stables are quite prohibitive. It's hard for them to see their neighbours. They might just be able to see a horse sort of across the aisle. But also there's another situation where they can't escape their neighbours. So they actually have got a completely free gap between them and their neighbours, and no matter what they do, they can't get away from that equine company. Now, if your neighbouring horse is aggressive, then you can see that would be quite stressful for them. So the type of interaction that they can have in their stable is really important. Now, if a horse is on box rest can be really hard on horses, as we know, and hard on the owners as well. So facilitating some equine companionship for a horse on box rest can be really hugely beneficial for that horse, even if it's just a paired friend coming to say hello over the door. All of those things can really, really benefit those horses at that time. Other things you can do for the social interaction is mirrors, like I've said before, with the box walking. Mirrors can help the horse feel like there is company there. Now, that might be beneficial if you're on a yard and you can't really adjust how your horse can access their neighbours or have any social touch. But horses will go to remarkable lengths to be able to touch their neighbours if that's possible. So we've looked at sort of sleep and how important that is for equines in stable. We have looked at the natural sort of behaviours of free living horses and how really in a stable environment we want to be trying to do as much as we can to encourage those more natural behaviours. Now, I think talking about that, I do talk a lot about, anybody who knows me will know I talk a lot about environmental enrichment. It's incredibly important for horses that are stabled and even for horses that are out on pasture as well. Our paddocks can be quite small if they're just with maybe one other companion, or whether they are out on their own. It's really, really important to consider the paddocks as well when we're thinking about enrichment. And when I'm talking about enrichment, I'm not really talking about, well, I am talking about, but it's more than adding in a licket or a treat ball. But it's actually considering their whole environment and how we can make it more complex and how it can sort of meet those species-specific needs that our horses have. So we've got to start looking, when you're looking at enrichment, what does the individual horse in that situation what would it most benefit from? If it's in a small stable with no ability to see its neighbours, social contact, social being able to see other horses, being able to touch other horses is going to be really important for that horse. If it's got a really big bed, if it can really see its neighbours but it can't escape them, then maybe adding a bit of a barrier so it's got actually choice whether to interact with its neighbour or not is really, really important. Now, an enriched environment does a lot more than just keep them entertained on a long winter's night. It improves their well-being. And when we think of well-being, we think of mental well-being, we think of actually having positive experiences. So that is really, really beneficial for a horse's welfare. An enriched environment that they're living in actually improves their cognitive performance. It can help them be more optimistic, which when we're thinking about how we train our horses and if we're wanting them to learn new things in their training, then making sure they live in an environment that's going to optimize that is really beneficial for the horse and also for us as well. So it is much more than, doing it because it's nice. It's actually really, really important and can have really big benefits for our horses and all their training. Generally, so an enriched environment for a horse would be the social contact. It would be living in a group as much as possible. And obviously I know with UK horses, especially at this time of year and the weather we've had today, management of land has quite a big impact on whether they can have year-round turnout. If you're on clay soils, such as I've got horses and we've got clay soil, it's really hard to manage the land so that it survives winter, keep the horses in optimal health in terms of skin for the standing in the mud, but also weighing that up with their well-being, making sure they have really good positive experiences every day, and not just sort of for a few hours a day, but as much as possible in their day. So what we find is when the horses live in a group, they're generally more, again, we've talked about this cognitive performance, they are more adaptable in their training. They show less difficult behaviours. They're easier to handle, they're less reactive, and they're generally a lot more open to this training and they're less stressed. So they are much easier to handle, and they're going to be, because they've got lower stress hormones in their body, they're going to be less reactive, which improves our safety and improves our welfare. So another aspect of enrichment when we're looking at the stable environment for a horse is movement. How can we encourage movement? And obviously stables aren't huge when you're a horse, so we can think of how we can present their forage. When we look at their natural grazing behaviour, you can look at this movement, this walking and this stepping and this taking a bite and moving on. Now, no stables aren't very big, but you can spread forage around your stables. You can offer different types of forage, hay, haylage, a straw bed, and all of that will encourage this movement in between food sources. You can replicate browsing by having maybe a high hay net, but you can also really promote natural grazing position by having floor-based forage. You can have it quite a lot of hay bars now. You can have hay just loose on the floor as well. But just having this variety so your horse gets choice. Choice is such an important aspect of any animal's environment. Being given that, even if it's a sort of a limited choice, it does help our horses feel more positive about their environment. Because when you've got choice, you do feel more optimistic. So we can spread our forage around, we can put it up high, we can put it down low, we can put it in small holes, larger holes. For those laminitic ponies, I often get asked questions about ponies on box rest and optimising the sort of box rest environment for laminitic ponies. That's incredibly hard. They're often really restricted in terms of their movement and also what they can eat. But I think that's where it's really, really important to work with your vet and say, okay, what can I do? What can my pony be allowed to do, or horse? how much space can they have? Do they have to be completely restricted all the time, or can they have the ability to walk around a small pen? Because often if horses get incredibly stressed in a stable, it's actually worse for them. So it's better that they have that bit more choice and they're able to move. When they are having their diet really restricted, then we can look at how we can reduce the nutritional value of the feed so that we can increase the amount that they can have. Again, they can use small hold hay nets, which will increase the amount of time that it takes them to eat, and maybe consider, if it is really reduced, giving them lots of small hay nets through the day so that there isn't one big event when they get all of their hay and then they're left with nothing for a long time. So those are some aspects you can think of. Another thing that's becoming much more popular is this inside-outside choice that we can give our horses. If there's any way of making a slightly outside pen on the stable, that's really beneficial because it allows the horse to choose. Do they want to be outside? Does that give them better enrichment through their vision? They can see more. Can they smell more? They've got slightly better air quality being out of that stable and in the open air. Is that outside pen able to have social contact with a neighbour if there's a stable next door that has the same? And again, it gives more choice into that horse's environment. And by making these environments more complex, we're hoping to increase these species typical behaviours. It is so important. If anybody's got any questions, feel free to send them in. So I've done my box walking question, but one other question I got was from somebody whose horse paws at the door. Now, pawing in the stable is something that is quite common. There are lots of products on the market for giving sort of a punishment, like an addition of maybe some water when they kick the door. Obviously, that's probably work to stop the behaviour in that moment, but it doesn't address why the horse is showing that behaviour. So it doesn't look at what is motivating the horse to be kicking the door. So it's not going to be a long-term solution, and it's not reducing that motivation. And that's what's really critical, because behaviour is communication. Behaviour is the way that they communicate with us and show us what's going on with them. So it's really important that we listen. Now, with the pawing at the door, some of the aspects I would consider are: when does it happen? Is it just before a feed? Is it when the owner's on their way? Is it a frustration? Is it impatience? Is it boredom? All of these kind of things are really important to consider. Now, if the pawing happens when the owner is going towards them with feed, if it continues when they have got their feed, you've got to consider if it's a bit of a repetitive behaviour and what's motivating it. But also you can think of actually the reinforcement of that pawing behaviour. It's really easy to reinforce some of these behaviours that we see in a stable due to the environment of yards. If a horse is at the end of a row of stables and they watch every other horse getting their feeds, they can get these sort of superstitious behaviours that, I got my feed when I was pawing at the door, or I got my feed when my ears were flat back because I was feeling so frustrated. And that is then reinforced by the feed being delivered, which can cause behavioural problems that way, because they can escalate to the more frustration they feel at being fed at the end of that row, then these behaviours can increase. So that is always something to consider, is, what is happening just before these behaviours. Okay, so one other little thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was these repetitive stereotypical behaviours. Again, like I said, they're not seen in free living horses. They therefore really must be related to the domestic environment and related to how their behavioural needs are being met. So a lot of stereotypical behaviours actually start quite early on in life, and once they are established, it can be incredibly. Then they are established. They have a sort of rewarding, internal rewarding sensation. Stereotypies are generally perceived to be coping mechanisms for stress. So it's really, really important that we don't try and stop them. Weaving bars, cribbing collars, they actually increase the stress that the horse feels. And when they are then given free, they're taken the collar off, the weaving bars are taken off, they will actually start the behaviour again at a higher intensity quite often, which indicates that it is really important to them, and it does help reduce those feelings of stress that they have. Now, there are management things that we can do that help to reduce the horse's need to show these sort of repetitive behaviours, and that is often very much management. Turnout, again, I know I say it quite a lot, is. Oh, hang on, I think I've lost everybody. There we go. The turnout's really important because then you are going to meet those needs with that social interaction. Again, mirrors can help in some forms of stereotypical behaviours. The bedding that's available can be have an impact on it, and the feeding regime as well. So if you've got a horse that's showing weaving or crib biting, they're actually really quite complex. So I would definitely advise getting some advice from a behaviourist, because there are small management changes that you can make that can make quite a big difference to how motivated they feel to show it. So we don't want to be looking to stop them, because that can create more stress, but we do want to be trying to optimise their environment so they don't feel the need to show them as much. Okay, so I think I'm gonna finish off again just saying how important enrichment is, about trying to increase those species typical behaviours that we want to see, increasing the complexity of your horse's environment, trying to give them some challenges with their enrichment, not too much to cause frustration, but give them something to really interact with. And as well, a really big factor is increasing choice. You should be looking at the enrichment that each individual horse needs in their environment. We want to be looking at increasing movement, spreading the forage around. We can introduce things like treat balls and lickets, which can be interesting for the horse for a period of time. But really, we want to be looking at the environment, seeing how we can increase those social interactions, even when they're stabled, by bringing friends over, or by considering how they can see and or touch their neighbours. So much that we can do to enrich our environments. We can bring in natural forage from the hedgerows, non-poisonous, obviously check what you're picking. And that can really enrich in terms of scent, in terms of taste, in terms of texture. We can bring in different scents. Again, that's really important for horses, is smell. So different types of teas, you can make them warm, cold. All of these are giving choice, and they're adding to their environment. So I haven't had any questions come through. I hope I answered the questions that I got beforehand. If you've got any questions, feel free to put them through. But otherwise, I think I will end it there. It's been lovely chatting, and I hope it's been useful. I kind of feel like I jumped around subjects a little bit there, but hopefully you'll be able to take something away from it. So thank you very much for listening, and maybe do it again. Cheers.